continuing looking at God's attributes, we at times have referred to God's attributes as perfections. And this is important, and why sometimes we use it interchangeably, because when it comes to God's attributes, we understand that these are the very essence of his being. They are the perfect standard in which we derive our understanding of many of these attributes, so thus they need to be perfect or perfections. This means that any time God is displaying any of these attributes, he is displaying them perfectly and without contradiction, meaning that they will not contradict any one of his other attributes. This also means that if God's attributes are his very being, this means that he is showing forth all of his attributes at all times. This is an area in which we as humans sometimes struggle to comprehend, but God is not a human. God is God, and thus he is distinct from us in this way that he has all of these attributes that are perfect. They are his perfections. They are shown at all times, every single one of them, and it would be inconsistent with his nature if he were to withhold one for the sake of the other, but rather he perfectly displays all of his attributes at all times in the perfect way. This, again, defies what we are able to truly comprehend, as we cannot comprehend all attributes all the time perfectly, but this is an essential teaching that will help us understand not only God himself, but it will also help us understand God's works. It will help us understand God's ways and his will for our lives, and this helps keep an accurate view of God in our mind, which is important, because if we start to lose our accurate view of God, who he is, what he does, why he does it, it can lead to blasphemous thoughts, blasphemous thinking, even blasphemous actions, as we may be accusing God of things that are not rightfully accused to him. Maybe another way of thinking of this is that God cannot withhold or lessen another one of his attributes for the sake of another, if that's an easier way for you to maybe think of this and comprehend it. Again, for instance, you cannot lessen his justice for the sake of his love. So we see that this is kind of an example of how this plays out, and hopefully at this point, going over it for several weeks, it's a little bit easier for you to digest and understand as we move forward looking at God's attributes. So as we've gone through and defining some of these attributes, we have taken some time to categorize these attributes. Now, when we first initially looked at the categorization of these attributes, we had three different categories, and it's important to note that these are not categories God has defined, but rather man, in his attempt to better understand God, has used to help man in his mind keep them. But instead of going through these three, I think what may be more beneficial to us as far as a simple understanding is to break them into two different categories. And the two categories that I really want us to focus in on are attributes that are uniquely God's as one group, and then another group or category as attributes that as created beings in God's image we can imitate. So we have one category of these are attributes that only God has. No one else, no other created being has the ability to show forth these or mimic these in any way. They are unique to his very nature. And then we have God's attributes that are able to be mimicked or shown within our lives, obviously not in the perfection in which God shows them, but nevertheless we are to seek and strive to show them as God would show them. As we've gone through this, we have gone in no particular order as far as these attributes. We have defined three attributes up to this point. The first attribute that we looked at was the attribute of eternity, the fact that God is eternal. Simply put, this means that God exists endlessly. Now, existing endlessly means that it's existence endlessly in both directions. We have a little bit of an easier time understanding endless existence as far as future goes, but we have a hard time grasping endless existence as far as past goes. But nevertheless, that is indeed God, where he has had no beginning and he will have no end. The scriptural support that we looked at this was Psalm 90 verse 2 and Genesis 21:33. And as we looked at some implications for us in our lives, Particularly with the attributes of God, this means that God never ends. He never has a beginning, meaning that we can have confidence that God will never cease, and thus his promises, comfort, provisions, and sustainments will be just as eternal as he is. The second attribute that we looked at was God's attribute of freedom. Now, this is one that we are a little bit more familiar with potentially. God's freedom states that he is independent of his creatures and his creation. So, again, very simply put, God is free, meaning he has no dependent ties to anything that he has created or any creature that he has created. Scripturally, we find support of this in Isaiah 40, verses 13 through 14. And the implication for us is that if God is free and independent from his creatures and his creation, this means that any role that God has within his creation or in those who he created lives is completely of his own will and his own volition. This means that God has chosen to have the role that he has within each and every one of our lives. There is no constraint other than God's freedom of will. So we see, and this is a great blessing, as God's mercy, God's grace, many of the other attributes that he shows forth to us are his choosing to show to us. Nothing that we deserve, nothing that we have earned, nothing that we can demand of God, but purely by his free will has he chosen to show those to us. Last week, as we continued, we looked at the third attribute, which is the attribute of holiness. We defined this attribute as God being totally separate from all that is unclean and evil, while also being positively pure, thus distinct from all others. So not only is he separate from anything that is viewed as unclean or viewed as evil or sinful, but he is also positively pure in every way, thus distinct from others. We looked at several passages that support this point, both in the Old and New Testament. Some of those passages include Leviticus 11:44, Joshua 24:19, Psalm 99:3, Isaiah 40:25, Habakkuk 1:12 in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, John 17:11, 1 Peter 1:14, and Revelation 4:8. And hopefully you noted those last week because there were a lot of passages that we looked at. Now, when we think of the application and implication of this attribute, the attribute of God's holiness, there are many implications and many applications. This attribute is what constitutes us as sinners being separated from God. God being separate from sin, separate from evil, means that us as human beings, being fallen creatures, having sin, is created a separated divide because of the holiness of God that must be maintained. It also is what explains the necessity of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, because only God's holiness could be accepted for fellowship, and thus the holiness that needed to be imputed into our account must have been his own, thus the Son of God coming to die and be a sacrifice in his holiness and righteousness imputed to our account. Now, as far as how it affects our day-to-day lives, it should shape and mold our view of sin, and also our resistance to sin. If we understand how God feels towards sin, it should also then affect the way our view towards sin. If God is not accepting of something, then we should not be accepting of something. If God has laid out in his word what is right and what is wrong, we should seek to do that which is right and abstain from that which is wrong. So this is all based and contingent upon his holiness. This week, as we continue to try to tackle about two of these at a time, we'll be seeking to look at two of God's attributes, one of his attributes being his immutability and the other attribute being his infinity. So let's look first together at God's immutability. God's immutability. Now up to this point in this attribute, we have looked at and these other attributes to where we have had at least a slight idea of what they have meant before we have looked at them. And even particularly the reference to God, right? We have an idea of eternity, right? We have an idea of freedom. We have an idea of holiness. Now, immutability is something that it's a word that we don't use a lot anymore, and thus, due to the lack of usage, could be confusing if we do not understand this. And whereas there are some people, I'm not saying anyone particularly in here, but rather just in my experience, I found that there are those who resist what some may call religious jargon. And they would say that this word immutability may fall into this idea of religious jargon. But I believe that one of the purposes of our study here is to deepen our knowledge of theology. And this includes expanding our vocabulary and scholarly knowledge of God, as well as deepening our personal relationship with Him. So we see that as we look at this, it's not a bad thing to be introducing new words to us that we may not know before. In fact, it may increase our ability to further know more as we look at this. So as we look at the attribute of immutability, immutability means that God is unchangeable and thus unchanging. So when we refer to the immutability of God, we are referring to the fact that God never changes. Now again, this is a wonderful attribute of God, an attribute that people love to hold to of God. Again, we may not always know the word, but now we have the word to match this attribute. When God is immutable, it means He is unchangeable and thus unchanging. So it's a continuation of that fact that He is unchangeable and unchanging. This does not mean that God is not immobile or inactive. There are some that would say, well, if God is unchangeable and unchanging, then He's not going to move in any way. He's not going to be active within the lives of believers, not going to be active within human history, because He has established Himself and He will never change from that establishment or change moving forward. That's not what this means. It means that God is never inconsistent or inconstant or growing or developing. He is active in the lives of believers. He is active within His creation, but He is never inconstant. He is never growing or expanding in some way, and He is never developing like we develop. Right? We understand that every single one of us every day, maybe at some point we start regressing a little bit more than others, but throughout our lives we are always growing and developing. God is not like this. So let's dwell on this a little bit. We are all familiar with change, as change is an inevitable part of life. We cannot avoid the fact that there is change in our lives. As I always think of change, there is always a quote that I think of, and I'm going to reference this evening, and it may be a peculiar quote to some, as you may not be as familiar with this, but it's actually a quote from one of the Star Wars movies. I don't know how many people are Star Wars fans, but technically the first episode, The Phantom Menace, they were released in a weird way. This came out in the late 90s. This is highlighting the young Anakin Skywalker, and he is talking to his mother as he's about to leave, being freed from slavery. And as he is leaving, he runs back to his mother and says, "I don't want things to change." To which his mother responds, and this is the quote that I always hold to, "But you cannot stop the change any more than you can stop the sun from setting." And the point of this is that change cannot be stopped. Change is inevitable. Change is a part of every single one of our lives. And this seems to be something that we struggle with. We struggle with change. No matter what we do, there's always that invariable factor that something is going to change. But this is not true when it comes to God. God does not change. There is no degree of change in Him. This also means that He is consistent. There is no variation in God in any degree and any category. So as humans, as we see change being a constant, it is a wonderful thought, and we'll get to this more in our application, that we serve a God, and a God who cares for us, who is never changing. So when I say that change is a constant, there's one aspect of our lives that does not change, and that aspect is God. God does not change. There are two passages of Scripture that I've selected to cover this attribute. The first is in Malachi. We don't give the book of Malachi a lot of attention typically. Honestly, a lot of people may think of it as the joke that it's the only Italian prophet in the Old Testament. I'm not going to dive too far into that. I'll just leave that one there. But Malachi chapter 3, verse 6 is the passage that we have selected. Malachi 3:6 says, "For I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed." So in this passage we see again the fact that God is saying, I do not change. It is self-declared that God does not change. And it's actually because of his immutability, this fact that he doesn't change, is the reason why the sons of Jacob, the children of Israel, are not consumed. And this is extending to us that because God does not change is the same reason why we as believers are not consumed. A passage from the New Testament that helps us with this is James chapter 1, verse 17. James chapter 1 and verse 17. It says, "Every good gift and perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." Meaning that God, who is the one who gives us all good things, there is no variability in him, there is no shadow of turning, there is no changing the God who provides every good and perfect thing. So as we come to our application of this attribute, there is very clear and obvious application that we've already made. But the foundation that I want to build off of when it comes to the application of God's immutability is that God's immutability, or the fact that he does not change, assures us that none of God's attributes change. So that means any other attribute that we look at, whether previously that we've already looked at with eternity, freedom, and holiness, or any of the other ones that we'll look at moving forward, none of these change because of this foundational immutability that God does not change. Further application offers comfort and assurance that God's promises will not fail. It reminds us that God's attitude towards sin does not change, and God can never be coaxed or compromised into changing. This again separates us from God and makes him God. We cannot show this attribute, but we can be thankful to God that he is indeed immutable, as the rest of his attributes never change. He never changes. His care for us never changes. His promises never change. They're never walked back upon. His attitude towards sin and righteous living never changed, and there is no compromising on God's part, and there's no way to coax him into changing. This now leads us to our second attribute, and we'll look at this here quickly, and that is the attribute of infinity. The attribute of infinity. The next attribute of God that we will look at is this attribute that really almost goes hand in hand with God's eternality. Now, from our understanding of the word infinity, this tells us that that this is not an attribute that we can model, but rather an attribute that is unique to God himself, which is very clearly true. There is no aspect of our lives that we can claim as infinite. We are described as finite beings. But God is indeed infinite. His infinity means that he has no bounds or limits. Very simply, no bounds or no limits in any way. He is in no way limited by the universe or by a time-space boundary. Again, the only thing that we could maybe say would limit God isn't really a limit within itself, but it is his own attributes that may limit things that would not be consistent within his character. Things like, could God ever sin? God could not sin because of his holiness. Could God ever move a rock so big that he couldn't move it? Again, those illustrations aren't logically formed together based off of the very nature of his being. So we see that this is a great contrast to human beings, because we are reminded daily of our limits. We are reminded daily of our bounds. Again, it's very easy to see this In fact, these are oftentimes the frustrations that we face in life. The fact that maybe we can't do things the way that we once did. Maybe it's a way that we wish we could do more. Maybe it's a way that we're just not as proficient as we'd like to be. Any of these things show the fact that we are finite. These are not true when it comes to God. There are always things that we cannot do that we want to do. And we want to do them when we want to do them, but yet are limited. Another way that I'm reminded of this is the fact that I see this displayed continuously in the life of Jackson. He is vastly limited by the fact that he is 14 months old. This is why he can't talk. This is why he can't chew a variety of food. This is why, unfortunately, he can't put himself to sleep yet. Either way, he's very limited. Now, one may think that if God is infinite, this means that he's just spread out throughout the universe. That his infinicy, I guess is a way to put this, is just him being spread. But this is not how God's infinity works. It's not that he has one part of him here, another part of him there, another part in another spot. God's infinity is displayed in the entirety of his being in all areas to the max of his being. When it comes to scriptural support of God's infinity, we see Solomon reference God's infinity at the dedication of the temple in the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27 says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded." So as Solomon is talking about the temple that he has built for the Lord, he is saying to God that you are infinite. Earth cannot hold you. Heaven cannot hold you. The heavens of heavens cannot hold you. Because you are infinite in all areas in the entirety of your being. Paul also uses this attribute to argue against the false gods of the Athenians in Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, verses 24 through 28, it says, "God that made the world and all the things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. And hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. All is certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring." So we see that Paul very clearly is talking about God being infinite. He made the worlds. He made all things within the worlds. He is Lord of not only the earth, but also the heavens. He cannot dwell in temples. He cannot dwell in temples made of hands. He is not worshipped the way these false gods are worshipped, because he doesn't need this type of worship. He gives to all things breath and all things. Paul very clearly shows the infinite nature of God. Now, when we think of application for this point, there is a prevailing thought that I want us to consider. And that is, God is not limited. If God is not limited, then this also means that his other attributes are not limited. So really, as we're applying them, trying to get us to apply it all together. Not taking each one separately and distinctly, but rather keeping it all together. So his attributes are not limited. But along with his attributes not being limited, we understand that his resources are not limited. It's not that in the life of the believer or the life of people, God says, I only have so much that I can give you, and once I'm out, I'm out. It's not how God works. God is infinite. His resources are infinite. His grace in our lives is infinite. There is no point where God looks down at the barrel and says, uh-oh, I got to restock. God has infinite resources. They're not limited in any way, which means that his care and provision for his children is not limited. Which means that when we go through life and we think, God, why are you not giving me what I want or what I think I need? We can, at the very least, there are other things that may need to be addressed if we're thinking that way, but at the very least, we can be assured that God is not providing these things because he's out or he's empty. God has everything that he needs, everything that we need in an infinite supply. This means that we can trust in the God who has no limit to meet our needs. It has no limit to meeting our physical needs. There's no limit to meeting our spiritual needs. There's no limit to meeting our emotional needs. Because of God's infinity, he is unlimited in every way. As we conclude this evening, we looked at two very important attributes of God that have yet again distinguished him as God versus anyone or anything in the world or in the universe. With God's immutability, we can rest in a God that never changes. His ways never change. Who he is never changes. His faithfulness never changes. This means that we can bank on the promises of God being sure, because God does not change. His faithfulness does not change. His promises do not change. When we contemplate God's infinity and the fact that God is infinite and not bound in any way, this means that we can rest that there is never a shortage of God. There is never a shortage of his attributes. There is never a shortage of his presence. There is never a shortage of his care or his provision. We can go to him with confidence, knowing that he can supply every single one of our needs. Which means that as we live our lives, we must answer the question, how are we dependent upon God's immutability? How are we dependent upon God's infinity? The further and further that we dwell on these things, the more and more admiration that we build towards God, the more and more love that we have towards God, the greater and greater view that we have towards God, which leads to a deeper and deeper worship of God. The more that we view his immutability and his infinity, particularly in relation to ourselves, the more thankful we should be that God has chosen to love us, that God has chosen to send his Son to earth to die for us, that in him we may have life, and that we may have it more abundantly, that we may have a relationship with him, that we can turn to him with every single one of our needs, every single one of our burdens, every single one of our cares, and live a life that is above sin, and live a life that is faithful and pleasing to him. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your attributes, particularly your attributes of immutability, and the fact that you never change, and the attribute of your infinity, that you don't withhold them. I pray that you help us to be pondering these, be thinking about these, thinking how they are played out in our day-to-day lives, that it could lead to a deeper and more meaningful relationship with you. Pray all these things in Jesus' name.